In the Middle Ages, growing food wasn't just important, it was survival. If your crops failed, there was no plan B. That kind of pressure led people to get creative, and some of their solutions were downright brilliant. Sure, most of us have never heard of these tricks, but medieval gardeners came up with strategies that still work today. They used nature, timing, and just a little bit of cleverness to turn even small gardens into food powerhouses. It all kicks off with something called the Three Sisters method. It sounds poetic, but it's actually genius. Medieval farmers realized that corn, beans, and squash weren't just good plants, they were better together. Like the ultimate group project, each one played a role. Corn grew tall and strong, giving the beans something to climb. The beans coiled up the corn and, in return, added nitrogen to the soil. Meanwhile, squash spread its broad leaves across the ground, shading out weeds and keeping the soil moist. No drama, no competition, just perfect cooperation. But timing was everything. Corn had to get a head start about 6 inches tall before beans and squash could join the party. Think of the corn as hitting the gym early so it could support its future roommates without falling over. The result: a tiny garden patch could grow enough food to support a whole family. That's not just gardening, that's engineering with vegetables. Of course, perfect planting means nothing without water. In medieval times, water was more precious than gold. So, people figured out how to water their gardens without wasting a single drop. Their solution? Clay pots. Unglazed ones, to be specific. Gardeners buried them next to the plants, leaving just the rim above the soil. These pots slowly leaked water underground right where the roots needed it. These clay pots weren't broken buckets, they were intentional. Porous vessels designed to seep moisture gradually. Plants loved them. The water didn't pool on the surface or evaporate in the sun. Instead, it created a steady, underground drip that kept roots perfectly hydrated. Medieval potters even made different sizes for different types of crops. Once buried, these pots needed almost no daily maintenance. Just fill them and let the earth do the rest. It was like having underground plumbing before plumbing was even a thing. While the plants sipped water in peace, gardeners had another problem to worry about: pests. Bugs didn't care how hard you worked, they'd still eat your crops if you let them. So medieval gardeners turned to herbs as natural pest control. These weren't just for cooking, they were like nature's version of home security. Tansy was great for repelling flies and ants with its bitter aroma. Rue worked like bug spray for beetles, sending them packing, and wormwood. That stuff was the ultimate insect bouncer. Fleas, moths, you name it, it cleared them out. Gardeners planted these herbs along garden borders or right between the rows, like tiny aromatic bodyguards. They required almost no effort to grow and thrived in poor soil. And the best part? They worked for free. In fact, people trusted these herbs so much, they even stuffed them in their mattresses to keep fleas away at night. That's dedication. But it wasn't just plants doing the heavy lifting. Smart gardeners brought in animals as workers too. Chickens, ducks, and geese weren't just cute, they were pest control on legs. Chickens scratched at the soil, digging up grubs and insects. Ducks patrolled damp areas, gobbling up slugs with wild enthusiasm. And geese. They had an uncanny ability to tell the difference between weeds and crops. They'd eat the weeds and leave your veggies alone. That's not just helpful, that's miraculous. And in return for their services, these animals got room and board. In other words, medieval gardeners created the first live-in employment system, complete with poop. And that poop, aka manure, was garden gold. Fertilized the soil naturally, making everything grow better. Chickens did the dirty work and didn't even know it. Beyond managing animals and herbs, medieval gardeners even looked to the stars for guidance. Literally, they believed the moon affected plant growth, so they followed lunar phases like a gardener's Bible. When the moon was waxing growing bigger, they planted leafy crops, like lettuce and spinach. When it was waning, they switched to root veggies like carrots and beets. Why? They figured if the moon could move oceans, it could probably nudge a carrot or two. During the waxing phase, energy supposedly flowed upward into stems and leaves. During waning, it shifted down into roots. Whether or not it was scientifically sound, it helped gardeners stay organized and their crops thrived. They even made lunar calendars, carefully noting which days were best for which tasks. These were like gardening horoscopes, except they actually worked. Whether it was moon magic or just solid planning, the system kept their gardens productive through the seasons. But while the moon gave them planting dates, the earth gave them the rest of the clues. Soil mattered. Medieval gardeners were like dirt detectives. They didn't need fancy tests, they used their senses. Good soil had earthworms, nature's tiny quality inspectors. Lots of worms meant happy dirt. And certain wild plants like chickweed or nettles only grew in rich soil, so spotting them was like seeing a welcome to fertile land sign. They'd also check the smell. Healthy soil had a rich, forest-like scent. Sour or rotten-smelling dirt, not good. They'd grab handfuls, squeeze it, and look for the perfect crumbly texture. Even the color told stories. Dark soil meant nutrients. Pale soil needed help. Reading the ground was like flipping through the pages of a living book. It told them one very important thing: whether or not their dinner would grow. But even if the soil was perfect, medieval gardeners had to deal with winter. Freezing temperatures didn't mean gardening stopped. It just meant gardeners got more creative. They built simple greenhouses called cold frames, using glass or even thin animal horn to trap warmth over their beds. These tiny structures collected heat during the day and shielded plants from freezing air at night. Like tucking your plants into a cozy bed, but with no complaining about the temperature. When it got seriously cold, they'd lay down straw or even wool blankets over the crops. Hardy veggies like kale and leeks didn't just survive, they thrived. Some gardens produced fresh food deep into December, and these were vegetables tougher than most people today. But the cleverest trick? Using manure as a heating source. That's right, medieval gardeners buried fresh manure in trenches below the planting beds. As it broke down, it generated heat, keeping the roots warm, even when the surface froze. It was like building an underground furnace powered by poop, and it worked. They had to time it right, letting the manure heat up and cool just enough so it wouldn't cook the roots. Horse manure was especially prized. It gave off consistent warmth. In the garden world, that stuff was worth more than furniture. So, with their underground manure furnaces and lunar calendars, medieval gardeners had already turned survival into an art form. But they didn't stop there. Waste wasn't something to throw away, it was something to transform. Enter composting. Kitchen scraps, garden waste, even human hair, if it came from something living, it went into the compost pile. Medieval gardeners layered green material like veggie peels with brown stuff like dried leaves and straw. Then, they'd sprinkle in a little wood ash or lime to keep the smell down and the neighbors happy. The result? A slow-cooked soil booster that turned garbage into garden gold. These compost piles weren't just heaps of rotting junk. They were carefully managed systems. Gardeners turned the piles regularly to speed up decomposition, monitored moisture levels, and used everything from animal bedding to crushed eggshells. Composting wasn't a side project. It was a core part of the gardening cycle. Once the compost was ready, it was dark, rich, and full of life. Exactly what the next round of crops needed. But it wasn't just what you fed the soil. It was also how you used it. Medieval farmers learned the hard way that planting the same crop in the same place year after year was a fast track to disaster. Soil nutrients would vanish, and pests would move in like squatters. So, they developed crop rotation systems. This wasn't random. It was a precise cycle. First, they'd plant legumes, beans, peas, plants that fixed nitrogen into the soil. Next came root vegetables, which broke up the dirt with their deep-growing roots. After that came grains, which used up the remaining nutrients. Then they'd let the land rest. It was like musical chairs for plants, but instead of getting kicked out when the music stopped, every crop got a turn in the best seat. Keeping track of which crop went where and when wasn't easy. Medieval farmers kept records written or remembered so they could rotate correctly year after year. It was simple, elegant, and incredibly effective. But crop rotation alone couldn't guarantee food security. What if a main garden failed? Medieval families had a backup plan. Secret gardens. These weren't metaphorical, they were real. Hidden plots of land tucked behind barns or along the edge of forests. Their purpose? To serve as an emergency food reserve? Secret gardens were often managed by women and used to grow cooking herbs, medicinal plants, or extra vegetables. They stayed out of sight not just from animals, but from potential thieves and even tax collectors. These small plots were packed with nutrients because families would quietly dump food scraps and compost there for years. Some of the richest soil on a property was in these little hideaways. It was low-key food insurance. If the main crop failed, there was still kale growing behind the shed. Meanwhile, religious communities took gardening to the next level. Monasteries weren't just places for prayer. They were agricultural labs. Monks had the time, education, and stability to test new growing methods, and they were meticulous. Their gardens were laid out with geometric precision, like something out of a divine blueprint. Monks organized garden beds into grids, raised plots, and symmetrical patterns. They kept detailed planting maps showing what grew where and when. They recorded weather, harvests, pests, everything. These weren't casual hobbyists. They were full-time farmer scientists. And their findings often made their way back into the wider community. Monastery gardens served multiple roles. They provided food for daily meals, herbs for healing, and even rare plants for study. Some monasteries held gardening manuals and books, with knowledge passed down from other cultures, making them repositories of international agricultural wisdom. Outside monastery walls, not all useful plants were intentionally cultivated. In fact, medieval gardens looked wildly different from ours today. What we call weeds, dandelions, purslane, nettles were valuable resources back then. Purslane, for example, was a nutrient-rich succulent that thrived in dry, poor soil. It could be eaten raw in salads or cooked like spinach. Kids knew where to find it, and families knew how to use it. It wasn't a nuisance, it was dinner. Nettles were another win. Young nettle leaves were boiled and eaten like greens. Older plants, those were used to make fabric, rope, and even medicine. Wild plants served 1,000 purposes, and children often gathered them as part of their daily chores. Certain weeds even made great dyes for coloring clothing: yellow from weld, red from madder, and green from nettles. Letting weeds grow was just another way of using every possible resource. Waste not, want not. While plants were valuable, seeds were priceless. Buying seeds every year wasn't an option for most people. So, medieval gardeners became expert seed savers. The process was intense. They'd mark the best plants in the garden while they were still growing, tying cloth or placing stones nearby. Only the most productive disease-resistant plants got their seeds harvested. These seeds weren't just next year's garden, they were next year's survival. Timing was crucial. Seeds had to be fully mature, but not yet scattered or eaten. Once harvested, seeds were dried carefully and stored in clay jars or cloth bags. Families used symbols or colors to tell them apart, and if stored properly, they could last for years. Some people valued their seed stash more than their jewelry. After all, jewelry can't feed you in February. And what about tools? Medieval gardeners didn't have sheds full of gear. Most families owned just a few essential tools, maybe a hoe, a spade, and a pruning knife. These had to last for decades, so tool maintenance was serious business. Tools were stored in huts or barns, close to the garden but protected from weather and theft. During the winter, when garden work slowed down, people would sharpen blades, oil wooden handles, and make small repairs. A dull hoe in spring meant delayed planting, and nobody could afford that. Inside these tool sheds, shelves might hold more than just metal. Bundles of herbs, dried seeds, spare handles, and wax for sealing jars. It was part hardware store, part apothecary, part seed bank. These places weren't just storage, they were lifelines, okay? And just like tools, labor was valuable too. That's why many villages created shared gardens, communal plots where multiple families worked together. Everyone brought something to the table: seeds, tools, time, experience, and in return, they all shared the harvest. It was like a neighborhood potluck, except the potluck started in spring and lasted until winter. Elderly members might prep seeds or give advice. Younger folks handled digging and carrying. When harvest came, everything was divided up, not always perfectly, but fairly enough to keep the peace. These communal gardens weren't just practical, they built relationships. They turned isolated struggles into shared successes. They helped entire communities eat better, plan better, and survive better. And none of it worked without timing. Medieval gardeners tracked the year like clockwork. They carved calendars into wooden boards, noting every planting window, harvest season, and frost date. These weren't vague reminders. They were specific, personalized, and local. One family might add moon phases, while another tracked bird migrations or insect hatches. Gardening wasn't just planting seeds. It was reading the earth, watching the skies, and passing down knowledge generation after generation. These handmade calendars became the backbone of every productive garden. It helped families know exactly when to sow cabbage, when garlic should be harvested, and when to prune berry bushes. Some even incorporated religious festivals, because if you already remembered a saint's day, you might as well use it as a planting reminder too. Over time, these calendars became as reliable as the changing seasons themselves. But medieval gardeners didn't stop at tracking time. They also used specific plants to protect others intentionally. One of their most powerful allies? Garlic. Garlic was a triple threat. It fed you, healed you, and defended your garden. Its strong smell came from sulfur compounds that bugs absolutely hated. Aphids, rootworms, and many soil pests avoided it like the plague. Gardeners planted garlic around the edges of garden beds like a living force field. It was like having a guard dog for your lettuce only, quieter and tastier. And garlic didn't just protect the nearby crops. People steeped garlic cloves in water for a few days to make what we might call garlic tea, then sprayed it over plant leaves. That spray worked as a natural insect repellent and mild antifungal. It didn't poison pests, it just made the garden smell so intense that bugs turned around. And while that scent might offend the occasional neighbor, it definitely kept the tomatoes safe. Still, medieval gardeners went beyond garlic. They figured out something incredibly clever: trap crops. Trap crops were sacrificial plants that acted like bait. You'd plant something irresistible to pests like mustard on the outskirts of the garden. The pests would flock to it, munch happily, and leave the real food alone. Then you could destroy the trap crop or simply keep an eye on it as your early warning system. Think of it as opening a bug buffet far away from your main course. Mustard was especially popular. Flea beetles, aphids, cabbage worms, all of them loved it. So gardeners used it as a magnet. Radishes worked too, especially for soil pests like root maggots. The trick was in the timing. Trap crops needed to be up and running before your main crops got going, so that way the bugs would be drawn to the decoy plants first. It was like battlefield strategy, but with vegetables instead of soldiers. In larger gardens, multiple trap crops were used to target different types of pests. It was all about balance, sacrificing a few plants to save many. And that strategy fit into a bigger philosophy medieval gardeners held: build systems that keep producing year after year. Which brings us to perennial crops. Perennials don't need to be replanted every season. So once they're established, they just keep coming back. That made them incredibly valuable in a time when labor, seeds, and time were limited. Rhubarb, asparagus, berry bushes, these weren't just food, they were investments. Asparagus was a favorite. It popped up early in spring, long before most annuals could be planted. When winter stores were running low, asparagus offered a fresh, reliable harvest. Rhubarb served a similar role, providing tart stems for pies and preserves. And berry bushes, those were long-term payoffs. They took a few years to mature, but once they did, they delivered fruit for decades. Berry bushes also acted as natural fences, keeping livestock out, marking borders, and even deterring thieves with their thorny branches. They were practical, tasty, and nearly maintenance-free, but placement was key. Since they'd stay in one spot for years, gardeners planted them along edges, near fences, or in designated beds where they wouldn't get in the way of annual planting. And medieval gardeners didn't just wait for their perennials to grow. They propagated them, dividing mature clumps, taking cuttings, or transplanting shoots. It was a way to grow more food without needing more seeds or space. It's like cloning your favorite fruit bush, but with mud instead of science fiction. Ultimately, all these techniques — trap crops, composting, moon planting, secret gardens — came down to one idea: work with nature, not against it. Medieval gardeners didn't have chemical fertilizers or fancy tools. They had their eyes, their hands, and a deep understanding of how the natural world worked. They watched birds, studied soil, listened to elders, and passed down what they learned. And with that knowledge, they turned humble plots of earth into thriving food systems. Their gardens weren't just places to grow food. They were living systems, carefully balanced and deeply respected. Every plant had a role, every waste had value. Every season brought both challenges and opportunities. In a world without grocery stores or backup plans, these gardens meant life or death. And the people who worked them, mostly women, elders, and children, weren't just gardeners. They were scientists, engineers, environmentalists, and caretakers of generational wisdom. And maybe the most impressive thing? So many of their techniques still work today. If you've ever used compost planted by the moon or stuck marigolds between your tomatoes to keep bugs away, you've tapped into this ancient knowledge. You've joined a tradition that stretches back centuries, built by people who looked at a field of dirt and saw a feast waiting to grow. So next time you water a plant, pull a weed, or sprinkle seeds into the soil, remember this: you're not just gardening. You're continuing a legacy of resilience, creativity, and respect for the land passed down from people who had nothing but made everything grow.